I'm live. I'm reading a novel by Greene, The Comedians. It was published in 1966, and it is about the three comedians are Mr. Smith, the presidential candidate, Mr. Jones, who calls himself Major Jones, and Mr. Brown, who is reading this story. It described the journey on a cargo ship to Port-au-Prince in Haiti. Mr. Brown has a hotel on Haiti, which he's tried to sell in vain. There's much corruption going on, and he is describing the situation in Haiti in those days. We are now in the second part of this book, in chapter 5, and it is Roman 1. Next day, a number of things distracted me from the fate of Jones, but I do not believe that Mr. Smith for one moment forgot him. I saw him in the bathing pool at 7 in the morning, lumbering up and down, but that slow motion from the deep to the shallow end and back probably aided him to think. After breakfast, I wrote a number of notes, which Mrs. Smith typed for him. He wrote a number of notes which Mrs. Smith typed for him on a portable corona, using 2 fingers, and he dispatched them through Joseph by taxi. One note was to his embassy, another to the new Secretary for Social Welfare, whose appointment had been announced that morning in Petitpierre's paper. He had enormous energy for a man of his age, and I'm sure he was never for a moment distracted from the thought of Jones sitting on the bucket in his prison cell, while he remembered the vegetarian centre, which one day would remove acidity and passion from the Haitian character. Simultaneously, he was planning an article on his travels, which he had promised to write for his hometown journal. A journal, needless to say, democratic and anti-segregationist and sympathetic towards vegetarianism. He had asked me the day before to look his manuscript over for errors of fact. The opinions, of course, are my own, he added, with the wry smile of a pioneer. My first distraction came early, before I had got up, when Joseph knocked on my door to tell me that, against all probability, the body of Dr. Philipots had already been discovered. As a consequence, several people had left their homes and taken refuge in the Venezuelan embassy, including a local police chief and an assistant postmaster and a schoolteacher. No one knew what their connections had been with the ex-minister. It was said that Dr. Philipots had killed himself. But of course no one knew how the authorities would describe his death. As a political assassination, perhaps engineered from the Dominican Republic? It was believed the president was in a state of fury. He had badly wanted to get his hands on Dr. Philipots, who one night recently, under the influence of rum, was said to have laughed at Papadoc's medical qualifications. I sent Joseph to the market to gather all the information he could. My second distraction was the news that the child, Angel, was ill with mumps, in great pain. Martha wrote to me, and I couldn't help wishing him another turn of the screw. She was afraid to leave the embassy in case he asked for her, so it was impossible for her to meet me that night as we had arranged by the Columbus statue. But there was no reason, she wrote, why, after my long absence, I should not call in at the embassy. It would seem natural enough. A lot of people made a point of dropping in now that the curfew had been raised. If they could avoid the eye of the policeman at the gate, and he usually took a ration of rum in the kitchen at 9, she supposed they were preparing the ground in case a time came when they wanted to claim political asylum in a hurry. She added at the end of her note, "Louis will be pleased. He thinks a lot of you," a phrase which could be interpreted 2 ways. Joseph came to my office after breakfast when I was reading Mr. Smith's article to tell me the whole story of the discovery of Dr. Philipots' body, as it was now known to the stallholders in the market, if not yet to the police. It was one chance in 1,000 which had led the police to the corpse that Dr. Maggiot and I had expected to lie concealed for weeks in the ex-astrologer's garden. A bizarre chance, and the story made it hard for me to pay much attention to Mr. Smith's manuscript. One of the militiamen on the roadblock below the hotel had taken a fancy to a peasant woman who was on her way up to the big market at Kenscoff early that morning. He wouldn't let her pass, for he claimed she was carrying something concealed underneath her layers of petticoat. She offered to show him what she had there, and they went off together down the side road and into the astrologer's deserted garden. She was in a hurry to complete the long road to Kenscoff, so she went quickly down upon her knees, flung up her petticoats, rested her head on the ground, and found herself staring into the wide glazed eyes of the ex-minister for social welfare. She recognized him, for in the days before he came to political office he had attended her daughter in a difficult accouchement. The gardener was outside the window, so I tried not to show undue interest in Joseph's narrative. Instead, I turned a page of Mr. Smith's article. Mrs. Smith and I, he had written, left Philadelphia with much regret after we had been entertained by the Henry S. Ox, whom many readers will remember for their hospitable New Year Eve parties at the time they occupied 2041 Delancey Place. But the sorrow of leaving our good friends was soon lost in the pleasure of making new ones on the SS Medea. Why did they go to the police, I asked. The natural thing for the couple to have done after the discovery was to slip away and say nothing. She screamed so loud, the other militiamen, "He come." I skipped a page or two of Mr. Smith's typewriting and came to the arrival of the Medea at Port-au-Prince, a black republic, and a black republic with a history, an art, and a literature. It was as if I were watching the future of all the new African republics, with their teething troubles over. He had no intention, I'm sure, of appearing pessimistic. Of course, a great deal remains to be done even here. Haiti has experienced monarchy, democracy, and dictatorship. But we must not judge a colored dictatorship as we judge a white one. History in Haiti is a matter of a few centuries. And if we still make mistakes after 2,000 years, how much more right have these people to make similar mistakes, and to learn from them perhaps better than we have done? There is poverty here. There are beggars in the streets. There is some evidence of police authoritarianism. He had not forgotten Mr. Jones in his cell. But I wonder whether a colored man landing for the first time in New York would have received the courtesy and friendly help which Mrs. Smith and I enjoyed at the immigration office of Port-au-Prince. I seemed to be reading about a different country. I said to Joseph, "What are they doing with the body?" "The police wanted to keep it," he said, "but the ice plant at the mortuary was not working." "Does Madame Philipot know?" "Oh, yes. She has him in Monsieur Hercule Dupont's funeral parlor. I think they bury him double quick." I couldn't help a feeling of responsibility for Dr. Philipots' last rites. He had died in my hotel. "Let me know what the arrangements are," I said to Joseph, and turned back to Mrs. Smith's travelogue. For an unknown stranger like myself to be given an interview by the Secretary of State on my first day in Port-au-Prince was another example of the astonishing courtesy which I have met everywhere here. The Secretary of State was about to leave for New York to attend the conference of the United Nations. Nonetheless, he gave me half an hour of his precious time and enabled me, through his personal intervention, with the Secretary for the Interior to visit an Englishman in prison, a fellow passenger on the Medea who had unfortunately, through some bureaucratic mistake liable to happen in much older countries than Haiti, fallen foul of the authorities. I am following the case up, but I have small fear of the result. Two qualities which I have always found strongly implanted in my colored friends, whether living in the relative freedom of New York or the undisguised tyranny of Mississippi, are a regard for justice and a sense of human dignity. In reading Churchill's prose works one is aware of an orator addressing an historic chamber, and in reading Mr. Smith, I was conscious of a lecturer in the hall of a provincial town. I felt surrounded by well-meaning middle-aged women in hats who had paid $5 to a good cause. I look forward, Mr. Smith continued, to meeting the new Secretary for Social Welfare and discussing with him the subject which readers of this paper will have long regarded as my King Charles head, the establishment of a vegetarian center. Unfortunately, Dr. Philipots, the former minister to whom I carried a personal introduction from a Haitian diplomat attached to the United Nations, is not at the moment in Port-au-Prince, but I can assure my readers that my enthusiasm will carry me through all obstacles, if necessary, to the President himself. From him I can expect a sympathetic hearing, for before he went into politics, he won golden opinions as a doctor during the great typhoid epidemic some years ago. Like Mr. Kenyatta, the Prime Minister of Kenya, he also has made his mark as an anthropologist. Mark was an understatement, I thought, of Joseph's crippled legs. Later that morning, Mr. Smith came shyly in to hear what I thought of his article. It would please the authorities, I said. They'll never read it. The paper has no circulation outside Wisconsin. I wouldn't bank on their not reading it. Not many letters leave here nowadays. It's easy enough to censor them if they want to. You mean they'd open it? He asked with incredulity. But he added quickly, oh well, it's been known to happen even in the USA. If I were you, just in case, I'd leave out all reference to Dr. Philipots. But I've said nothing wrong. They may be sensitive about him at the moment. You see, he's killed himself. Oh, the poor man, Mr. Smith exclaimed. What on earth could have driven him to that? Fear. Had he done something wrong? Who hasn't? He had spoken ill of the president. The old blue eyes turned away. He was determined to show no doubt to a stranger, a fellow white man, one of the slavers' race. He said, I would like to see his widow. There might be something I could do. At least Mrs. Smith and I ought to send flowers. However much he loved the blacks, it was in a white world he lived. He knew no other. I wouldn't if I were you. Why not? I despaired of explaining, and at that moment, as bad luck would have it, Joseph entered. The body had already left Monsieur Dupont's funeral parlor. They were taking the coffin up to Pentonville for burial, and were halted now at the roadblock below the hotel. They seem in a hurry. They're very worried, Joseph explained. There's nothing to fear now, surely, Mr. Smith said. Except the heat, I added. I shall join the cortege, Mr. Smith said. Don't you dream of it. Suddenly I was aware of the anger those blue eyes were capable of showing. Mr. Brown, you're not my keeper. I'm going to call Mrs. Smith, and we shall both at least leave her behind. Don't you really understand the danger? And it was on that dangerous word, danger, that Mrs. Smith entered. What danger? She demanded. My dear, that poor Dr. Philipots, to whom we had an introduction, has killed himself. Why? The reasons seem obscure. They are taking him for burial to Pentonville. I think we should join the cortege. Joseph, please. S'il vous plaît, taxi. What danger were you talking about? Mrs. Smith demanded. Do neither of you realize the kind of country this is? Anything can happen. Mr. Brown, dear, was saying he thought I ought to go alone. I don't think either of you should go, I said. It would be madness. But, Mr. Smith told you, we had a letter of introduction to Dr. Philipots. He's a friend of a friend. It will be taken as a political gesture. Mr. Smith and I have never been afraid of political gestures, dear. Dear, I have a dark dress. Give me 2 minutes. He can't give you even one, I said. Listen. Even from my office we could hear the sound of voices on the hill. But it didn't sound to me like a normal funeral. There was not the wild music of peasant pomp funebres, nor the sobriety of a bourgeois interment. Voices didn't wail. They argued. They shouted. A woman's cry rose above the din. Before I could attempt to stop them, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were running down the drive. The presidential candidate had a slight lead. Perhaps he maintained it more by protocol than effort, for Mrs. Smith certainly had the better gait. I followed them more slowly and with reluctance. The Hotel Trianon had sheltered Dr. Philipots, both alive and dead, and we were still not rid of him. At the very entrance of the drive, I saw the hearse. It had apparently backed in so as to turn away from Pentonville, in retreat towards the city. One of the hungry, unowned cats which haunted that end of the drive had leapt, in fear of the intrusion, onto the top of the hearse, and it stood there, arched and shivering, like something struck by lightning. No one attempted to drive it away. The Haitians may well have believed it to contain the soul of the ex-minister himself. Madame Philipots, whom I had met once at some embassy reception, stood in front of the hearse and defied the driver to turn. She was a beautiful woman, not yet 40, with an olive skin, and she stood with her arms out like a bad patriotic monument to a forgotten war. Mr. Smith repeated over and over again, "What's the matter?" The driver of the hearse, which was black and expansive and entrusted with the emblems of death, sounded his horn. I had not realized before that hearses possessed horns. 2 men in black suits argued with him, one on either side. They had got out of a tumble-down taxi, which was also parked in my drive, and in the road stood another taxi, pointing up the hill to Pentonville. It contained a small boy, whose face was pressed to the window. That was all the cortege amounted to. "What's going on here?" Mr. Smith cried again at his distress, and the cat spat at him from the glass roof. Madame Philipots shouted, "Salut!" at the driver and "Cochon!" Then she flung her eyes like dark flowers at Mr. Smith. She had understood English. "Vous êtes Américain?" Mr. Smith, expanding his knowledge of French nearly to his outer limit, said, "Oui." "The cochon, the salut," Madame Philipots said, still barring the way to the hearse, "wants to drive back into the city." "But why?" "The militia at the barrier up the road will not let us pass." "But why?" Mr. Smith repeated with bewilderment, and the 2 men, leaving their taxi in the drive, began to walk down the hill towards the city with an air of purpose. They had put on top hats. "They murdered him," Madame Philipots said, "and now they will not even allow him to be buried in our own plot of ground." "There must be some mistake," Mr. Smith said, "surely." "I told that salut to drive on through the barrier. Let them shoot, let them kill his wife and child," she added with illogical contempt. "They probably have no bullets in any case for their rifles." Madame, madame, the child, no, mama, mama, the child cried from the child. The child cried from the taxi. Chérie, tu m'as promis un glace de la vanille. Attends un petit peu, chérie. He wants an ice cream. I said, then you got through the first roadblock without being questioned? Yes, you understand, with a little payment. They wouldn't accept a payment up the road? She said, oh, he had orders. He was afraid. There must be a mistake, I said, repeating Mr. Smith. But unlike him, I was thinking of the bribe, which had been refused. You live here. Do you really believe that? She turned on the driver and said, drive on, up the road. Salute. And the cat, as though it took the insult to itself, leapt at the nearest tree. Its claws scrabbled in the bark and held. It spat once more over its shoulder at all of us with hungry hatred and dropped into the bougainvillea. The two men in black returned slowly up the hill. They had an intimidated air. I had time to look at the coffin. It was a luxurious one, worthy of the hearse, but it bore only a single wreath of flowers and a single card. The ex-minister was doomed to have an interment almost as lonely as his death. The two men who had now rejoined us were almost indistinguishable from the other, except that one was a centimetre or so taller, or perhaps it was his hat. The taller one explained, we have been to the lower roadblock, Madame Philipots. They say we cannot return with the coffin, not without the authorities with the authorization of the authorities. What authorities, I asked. The Secretary for Social Welfare. We all with one accord looked at the handsome coffin with its gleaming brass handles. There is the Secretary for Social Welfare, I said. Not since this morning. Are you Monsieur Hercule Dupont? I am Monsieur Clement Dupont. This is Monsieur Hercule. Monsieur Hercule removed his top hat and bowed from the hips. What's happening? Mr. Smith asked. I told him. But that's absurd, Mrs. Smith interrupted me. Does the coffin have to wait here till some fool mistake has been cleared up? I'm beginning to fear it was no mistake. What else could it be? Revenge. They failed to catch him alive, I said to Madame Philipots. They will arrive soon, that's certain. Better go to the hotel with the child. And leave my husband stranded by the road? No. At least tell your child to go and Joseph will give him a vanilla ice cream. The sun was almost vertical above us now. Splinters of light darted here and there from the glass of the hearse and the bright brass work of the coffin. The driver turned off his engine and we could hear the sudden silence extending a long, long way to where a dog whined on the fringes of the Capitol. Madame Philipots opened the taxi door and lifted the little boy out. He was blacker than she was, and the whites of his eyes were enormous, like eggs. She told him to find Joseph and his ice, but he didn't want to go. He clung on her dress. Mrs. Smith, I said, take him to the hotel. She hesitated. She said, if there's going to be trouble, I think I ought to stay here with Madame Philippe. Will you take him, dear? And leave you, dear? Mr. Smith said, no. I hadn't noticed the taxi drivers, where they sat motionless in the shadow of the trees. Now, as though they had been exchanging signals with each other while we talked, they started simultaneously to life. One swung his taxi out of the drive, the other reversed and turned. With the grinding of gears, they skidded together like decrepit racing motorists down the hill towards Port-au-Prince. We heard the taxis halt at the roadblock and then start off again and fade into the silence. Monsieur Hercule Dupont cleared his throat. He said, "You are quite right. I and Monsieur Clermont will take the child." Each seized the hand, but the little boy dragged to get away. "Go, chérie," his mother said, "and find a vanilla ice. Avec de la crème au chocolat." "Oui, oui, oui, bien sûr, avec de la crème de chocolat." They made an odd procession, the three of them, going up the drive under the palms between the bougainvilleas, two top-hatted, middle-aged twins with a child between. The whole Trianon was not an embassy, but I suppose that the brothers Dupont considered it was perhaps the next best thing, a foreigner's property. The driver of the hearse, too, we had forgotten him, abruptly climbed down and ran to catch them up. Madame Philipots, the Smiths, and I were alone with the hearse and the coffin, and we listened in silence to the other silence on the road. "What happened next?" Mr. Smith asked after a while. "It's not in our hands. We wait, that's all." "For what?" "For them." Our situation reminded me of that nightmare of childhood, when something in a cupboard prepares to come out. None of us was anxious to look at another and see his private nightmare reflected, so we looked instead through the glass wall of the hearse at the new shining coffin with the brass handles which was the cause of all the trouble. Far away in the land where the barking dog belonged, a car was taking the first gradients of the long hill. "They're coming," I said. Madame Philipots leaned her forehead against the glass of the hearse, and the car climbed slowly up towards us. "I wish you'd go in," I said to her. "It would be better for all of us if we all went in." "I don't understand," Mr. Smith said. He put out his hand and gripped his wife's wrist. The car had halted at the barrier down the road. We could hear the engine running. Then it came slowly on, in bottom gear, and now it was in view, a big Cadillac, dating from the days of American aid for the poor Haiti. It drew alongside us and 4 men got out. They wore soft hats and very dark sunglasses. They carried guns on their hips, but only one of them bothered to draw, and he didn't draw his gun against us. He went to the side of the hearse and began to smash the glass with it, methodically. Madame Philipots didn't move or speak, and there was nothing I could do. One cannot argue with 4 guns. We were witnesses, but there was no court which would ever hear our testimony. The glass side of the hearse was smashed now, but the leader continued to chip the jagged edges with his gun. There was no hurry, and he didn't want anyone to scratch his hands. Mrs. Smith suddenly darted forward and seized the two Tonton Marcout's shoulder. He turned his head and I recognized him. It was the man whom Mr. Smith had outstared in the police station. He shook himself free from the grip, and putting his gloved hand firmly and deliberately against her face, he sent her reeling back into the bushes of the bougainvillea. I had to put my arms around Mrs. Smith and hold him. "They can't do that to my wife," he shouted over my shoulder. "Oh, yes, they can." "Let me go," he shouted, struggling to be free. I've never seen a man so suddenly transformed. "Swine," he yelled. It was the worst expression he could find, but the Tonton Marcout spoke no English. Mr. Smith twisted and nearly got free from me. He was a strong old man. "It won't do any good to anyone if you get shot," I said. Mrs. Smith sat amongst the bushes. For once in her life, she looked bewildered. They lifted the coffin out of the hearse and carried it to the car. They wedged it into the boot, but it struck several feet out, so they tied it securely with a piece of rope, taking their time. There was no need to hurry. They were secure. They were the law. Madame Philipots, with a humility which shamed us, but there was no choice between humility and violence, and only Mrs. Smith had essayed violence. Went over to the Cadillac and pleaded with them to take her too. Her gestures told me that her voice was too low for me to hear what she said. Perhaps she was offering them money for her dead. In a dictatorship, one owns nothing, not even a dead husband. They slammed the door in her face and drove up the road, the coffin poking out of the boot like a box of fruit on the way to market. Then they found a place to turn and came back. Mrs. Smith was on her feet now. We stood in a little group and we looked guilty. An innocent victim nearly always looks guilty, like the scapegoat in the desert. They stopped the car and the officer, I assumed he was an officer, for the black glasses and the soft hats and the revolvers was all the uniform they wore, swung the car door open and beckoned to me. I am no hero. I obeyed and crossed the road to him. You own this hotel, don't you? Yes. You were in the police station yesterday? Yes. Next time you see me, don't stare at me. I don't like to be stared at. Who is the old man? The presidential candidate, I said. What do you mean, presidential candidate? For where? For the United States of America. Don't joke with me. I'm not joking. You can't have read the papers. Why has he come here? How would I know? He saw the Secretary of State yesterday. Perhaps he told him the reason. I expect to see the president. He expects to see the president. There's no election now in the United States. I know that much. They don't have a president for life like you do here. They have elections every 4 years. What was he doing with this box of offal? He was attending the funeral of his friend, Dr. Philipots. I'm acting under orders, he said with a hint of weakness. I could understand why it was these men wore dark glasses. They were human, but they mustn't show fear. It might be the end of terror in others. The tonton Macoute in the car stared back at me as expressionless as a gollywog. I said, in Europe we hanged a lot of men who acted under orders at Nuremberg. I don't like the way you speak to me, he said. You're not open. You have a mean way of talking. You've got a servant called Joseph, haven't you? Yes, I remember him well. I interviewed him once. He let that fact sink in. This is your hotel? You make a living here? No longer. That old man will be leaving soon, but you will stay on. It was a mistake you made to hit his wife, I said. It's the kind of thing he's likely to remember. He slammed the door shut again and then drove the Cadillac back down the hill. We could see the end of the coffin pointing out at us until they turned the corner. Again there was a pause, and we heard them at the barriers. Then the car put on speed, racing down towards Port-au-Prince. To where in Port-au-Prince? What use to anyone was the body of an ex-minister? A corpse couldn't even suffer. But unreason can be more terrifying than reason. Outrageous! It is outrageous, Mr. Smith said at last. I'll telephone to the president. I get that man. And I make a break here and continue reading